welcome to the Institute for Public Knowledge. I am Kate Bloom. I'm a senior fellow here with Kim Johnson, who we are going to learn from today and to celebrate her book, Dark Concrete, which has just come out. Kim is a colleague of mine in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, and she has for a very long time been a real champion of urban studies scholarship and urban studies teaching, including here at NYU in developing what we're, I think, still launching, which is the newly configured Metropolitan Studies major that we will have here. This book is very exciting for me because Kim came as a political scientist, which she still is, turns out. But she, when she described this project when it was in the very, very early stages, it was as a project that she felt really deeply invested in, that she was going to do something in this book that she really loved. And that was to explore these, the world of Black Power urbanism in Oakland and East Palo Alto and in Newark and East Orange. And that to me recommends it more than anything else, that Kim's brain is in it, obviously, but also very much her heart. And so I'm looking forward to hearing you talk about that today. And then joining her in discussion will be Christina Greer, who is an associate professor of political science at Fordham. And she is the author of Black Ethnics, Race, Integration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream, among other things. And also How to Build a Democracy from Fannie Hamer and Barbara Johnson to Stacey Abrams. She is also a weekly columnist for the Amsterdam News, which is cool. And finally, Domingo Morel is an associate professor at the Wagner School here at NYU, and also a faculty member in the Department of Politics. I'm not sure if I have to say the Wolf Family Department of Politics, but there it is. Pat, right? Yeah. Anyway, shout out to the Wills. And his research focuses on racial and ethnic politics, urban politics, education politics, and public policy. He's the author of Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy, which won the W. E. Du Bois Distinguished Award. And something close to my own heart, he also studies access to higher education and wrote a book called Developing Scholars, Race, Politics, and the Pursuit of Higher Education. So thank you, all three of you, for being with us tonight, and especially thank you, Kim, for writing this book and giving us the excuse to do it. As you know, if you've ever been to an IPK event, we have books for sale, and we encourage you to purchase them so that the bookseller does not have to haul all the books home himself. So, please consider doing that after the event. With that, hand it over to you.
Thank you. I should say I'm super nervous. I've been doing this for a while. I won't say how long. Now my students know that everyone still gets nervous, even though, But I just also want to sort of think there's a lot of people in this room who have a huge emotional and intellectual debt to and it's along the way. So we're thinking for that. We'll see more your ideas and will attribute them correctly to as I go through this, talking about my book. Also speak for about 30 minutes. Okay, so I like to see that the book starts with anecdata. I used to live in a town called Montclair, New Jersey, and it was all about taxes and all about, oh my gosh, we don't East Orange. And also, why is all of it going to those neighborhood people? And so it's kind of like daily taxes, and it's really exciting. At the same time, it was a significant part of my life in the north, in East Bay, and so how Oakland was kind of like a black city when I was growing up. And lo and behold, going to Oakland and realizing like there are a lot of people in Oakland, and certainly not a lot of people in San Francisco. And so this is like the beginning of that sort of anecdata which moves into the sort of thinking about this book. So I just want to keep one, I would try to keep one image, which is that image is a picture of Ross Baraka in the arms of Kenneth Gibson, who's America's first black man. And so what I want to think about is a book is about both beginnings and transitions, and not endings, but sort of possibilities. So I can just kind of keep that image in mind. So as I said, the book kind of starts with, ideally, it started with anecdata, but actually the book itself starts with a story about this house. This house, which went up for sale about 10 years or so ago, belonged to Bobby Seale, who, along with Huey Newton, wrote the sort of first black platform, the Black Panther platform, in the dining room of this house. This house had been bought for about $18,000 by his parents, who were migrants from the South, moved to Oakland, West Oakland, as part of the Great Migration, bought this house. So this was part of a very sturdy working class, black working class group. House is sold for multiples of $400,000, and Seale, on hearing the sale of the house, said, well, you know, things change, people change, how are the people? And then he says something curious, that this is the same thing, this is the same book that we're now into. And this he's alluding to the 2008-2005 mortgage crisis, which had basically devastated neighborhoods like this. In fact, in the book, there's a picture, image of a map that overlays foreclosures on top of the HLC Whitlock map. And what you see is the vast majority of foreclosures are happening in these Whitlock areas of Oakland. There's another image that didn't make it into the book because my editor was like, too many images, which is that another image actually showed what happened to these foreclosed houses. And what happens is that these foreclosed houses essentially were either flipped and became sort of contributed to the gentrification of some of the neighborhoods in and around this one, and others were flipped. So there's another book in this part which talks about sort of remaining black residents of this neighborhood, saying that, well, and that in fact, the neighbors were often calling us when they saw straight walking through their neighborhood, right? And so that's one of the stories. That's another story. This is Spirit House. This is where the 1967 Black Power image takes place. And what happens is in the early 2000s, to provide better access to the Performing Arts Center, which had been built in the 90s. And the Performing Arts Center was built in order to bring basically white suburbanites back into work so we could actually pay this place. Second story, a third story, this is East Palo Alto. I would just pay attention to that map in the middle. Palo Alto is basically bounded by Meta/Facebook on the north and the Google Plus on the south. So it is under incredible gentrification pressures and displacement. But the two images I think are very striking. The first image is an attempt, it's a little sort of strip mall that there's dozens of them in California. A strip mall that they renamed Miami Village, and had been part of trying to imagine a sort of self-community that was controlled by and fast forward to the 21st century, this is that image is a office complex that replaced sort of downtown, which had lots of beauty salons and barbershops and little stores, and that sort of basically disappears. And then my final image, this is East Orange. I call it sort of suburban Black respectability politics. And so the image on your right is Henry Bronco Ossie Davis, sorry. And they're celebrating the opening of the first Black-owned townhouse development in the US. And fast forward again, 50, 60 years later, this is announcing this new portion of high-rise in East Orange. So East Orange was 80% Black, largest by U.S. American population outside of New York City. Didn't know that. Also sort of facing these pressures. And so the question for me is, how do we understand the stories? How did we get from these areas that were identified as Black areas to areas that are less so, and are indeed disappearing as Black areas? And so the story that begins with a discussion about what I call the disruption of urban rural and highways. And what I argue is that urban rural and highways essentially, it's almost like you imagine like a game board that someone comes and just flips it up. And it sort of shatters communities, it shatters political arrangements. And so what I argue is Black Power Urbanism is one of the emerges in some places to try to rebuild and repair this kind of shattered physically, politically, and socially shattered landscape. So, if you know anything about urban renewal, it's incredibly destructive and always challenged from the very beginning, that it was not simply something that simply happened without challenge, that in all the 4 cases that folks are very much saying, hey, these are communities, why are you taking our communities, why are you destroying communities? And as we know, that urban renewal was incredibly violent. So this is an image of 7th Street, the sort of Captain shopping complex. This was the heart of Black West Oakland, which was totally from the West. This is sort of the junction. Secret reporters would go there, jazz musicians would go there. It really was this kind of vibrant urban comfort. That really is to show that here is a community that's still alive, right? So just during violence of that. And then this is another image. This is from a local newspaper, and it shows that literally it just looks like an old tank to like knock down these houses. And just I think it's what it says in comments. And then the other image is literally sort of, this is a highway that we'll see come up there. This is the Minutes Freeway, where they literally scraped away most of But urban renewal was predicated on decades of racial containment and exclusion and displacement. So this is an image of Orange. The image of the map, first map, is actually a map from the 1920s where they literally plotted every African-American and Italian residence in the neighborhood because they wanted to figure out how to sort of keep these neighborhoods either contained or in fact figure out a way to exclude them. So the next map next to it is Jones Street, which was the heart of kind of old Black East Orange. It had churches, it had sort of social service agencies that had been created by and run by African-Americans. They essentially went into replacing apartments that would basically be used for return of GIs. I also want to sort of point out this. So in both the Oakland case and the East Palo Alto case, the land or the buildings that are sort of opened up for development in these cities often for new subdivision housing, or the houses that are sort of available for folks who are coming up from the Great Migration. These are spaces that have previously been occupied by Japanese. So some of my so I really would think about this idea of urban renewal as not, and sort of post-war development is not simply black and white, that is actually included again, sort of these different kinds of violence. So after looking at this, looking at this disruption, I thought about what is sort of shaping, what's happening in terms of whether or not these black communities can respond effectively or not, actually rebuild in the face of this displacement and destruction. And this is where the political science comes in, which is that essentially what is in each of these cities is a power structure that essentially fundamentally excluded African Americans, Japanese Americans, etc., from any meaningful power or ability to sort of shape the city. So this is actually the mayors. These are the big city mayors of the early 1960s. You can see that they're pretty not very diverse. Some are Republicans and some are Democrats. And then I think this is just such an iconic urban renewal image, right? That it's these sort of planners and architects, again, not very diverse, kind of looking down, kind of rearranging the city in ways that sort of fits their aesthetic of what a city is and who belongs to that city. So part of the sort of black powers is that kind of rethinking who gets to own the city, who gets to not only control the city, but who gets to sort of define who the city is for and what the city should do for its citizens, all of its citizens. Closer to home, this is the mayor of Newark, the mayor of Oakland, the mayor of East Orange, and the group of people is basically the board of supervisors. So the interesting institutional story, and so I'm trying to also talk about political scientists, it's a story about thinking about the structures of urban politics. And so in urban politics, we think about a form versus machine, right? And so sometimes political institutions let people in very sort of structured ways, like machine politics based on ethnic politics, and other types of political structures, like reform structures, are geared towards basically elite control of politics. And so for Oakland and East Palo Alto, it really is a politics in which only the elite can sort of be involved. They don't really involve in sort of local politics. It's even worse for East Palo Alto because it's actually unincorporated. It's sort of just space on the edge of San Mateo County. So there's sort of this area that's far away and sort of easily ignored by these sort of, again, not very diverse board of supervisors. And so the story then is how do these different groups kind of think about and encounter these different institutional structures. So this is where I think about ideas, that it's a kind of rethinking about the old doesn't really work. The old has got us into this spot where cities are destroyed. And so what do we do next? So politically, we see the emergence of kind of this new sensibility that is quite distinctive from the civil rights movement that is still ongoing, right? So this is a really interesting image. This is Adam Clayton Powell looking at still commentary, and they're announcing the formation of a committee to explore the actual convening of a Black Power conference about Black Power. And it's just, I think, really interesting. So if you know anything about it, Adam Clayton Powell, he's not a radical at all, but even he sees this thing. What's going on? Something is different. Something is different that's not part of the civil rights movement. Something is different that's happening in cities outside of this, particularly outside of the South, in the North, in the West, and in the West. So a year later, we get the first Black Panther manifesto. The year after that, we get the actual first Black Power conference that's happened in 1967, literally days after still, smoke is still in the air. And we brought the locals from around the country, and some from outside the country, come to New York to kind of think about the way and so part of the book is kind of thinking about all of the things that happen at these different Black conventions, these manifestos, and documents, and really sort of piecing together the fact that I would argue there's the intellectual basis for Black power. That's not simply this iconic guidance or this sort of thing here, but it's actually thinking about what does it mean to be Black in these cities. And so this is an article that came out in 1966 by Grace and James Boggs, Grace Lee and James Boggs, who were partners and very well sort of Detroit Black activists circle, and they wrote this really important article, "The City is the Black Man's Land." I won't read the text, but at least don't read the text, it's too much. But essentially what they're arguing is that we had to sort of figure out, here we are, we have the chance to really have a meaningful impact on these cities because we're going to be, if not majority, near majority residents of these cities. And so what does it mean? And we can't simply do things as they've always been done before. We have to think about doing things differently. I think what's really interesting about this article is that another part they actually talk about automation. And they essentially say Black workers are the lowest on the industrial ladder. And when automation comes, when we be the first pushed out, we need to think about what happens to these people. So you're reading that and you're like, oh, here we are. But anyway, what I'm essentially arguing is that I'm really trying to trace this kind of creation of an body of knowledge, but also a body of sort of political practice about how do we think about cities and of Blacks, but also et cetera, people in cities. But it also, this is like, yay, this is where SCA, social cultural analysis, comes in. If I'd not been here, I would have written a very political science book, but now I'm like, oh, there's things like, there's no archive. And so thinking about how this actually appears in these other types of ways, and this is from a group called Parliament, and the song is called Chocolate Cities, and it's very funky, and I will play it or not, but I just imagine it's funky, and then this thing where they say, we got New York, we got Gary, somebody told me we got LA, and we're working on Atlanta. We didn't get our 40 acres in the field, but we got the season of Chocolate City. And this is really fascinating. As we build this idea, this imagined community, if you will, tell them to make sure they got their James Brown pass. Don't be surprised if Ali and Muhammad Ali is in the White House. Reverend Ike, Secretary of the Treasurer, Richard Pryor, Minister of Education, Steve Wonder, Secretary of Fine Arts, and Mr. Luca Friedman, First Lady. Are you out there, CC? Chocolate City's no dream, it's my piece of the rock. And I dig you, CC. God bless Chocolate City and its many settlers. And so reading that, thinking about this is not simply this random thing. This is people thinking about the cities are where this new idea of rebuilding, not only rebuilding communities, but also building new kind of sort of adjusting that situation for, again, not simply Black people, but also emphasizes that in all of these cities, there are other communities of color, and these activists are very much aware that there are other communities of color, and they're actually often working in coalition with these communities of color. So this, if you might recognize this is actually the image that we took from the book and made it into a cover. And this is from the copy of, this is from Model Cities application that we were submits in 1869 as part of its effort to kind of rebuild the city. And I just thought the title of it was really great. We want to go higher, 10 miles is the way. And this is a campaign flyer for in the upcoming mural race self-government is possible, 1970, let's do together. Brothers work. So really, I think what is interesting is seeing this kind of intellectual formation connected to sort of cultural formations, and then the way that it sort of gets connected to political action. And to me, that is really Black Power urbanism. So then I think about what I call instantiations. That is, how does this actually get put into practice? And here, I won't go to everything that I talk about. Please read my book, which is, for example, I talk about housing. This is Stella Wright houses. This is just one of these huge complexes of public housing projects that are sort of spread throughout, or actually, mostly concentrated in the Third Ward, which is the sort of traditional Black neighborhood of New York. And in the early 1970s, led by Black women, they conduct the longest running public housing venture. What ends up happening is that they essentially get the right to run their own hotel. So this is really, I think, important when thinking about mothers and families looking at and trying to figure out how do we live in housing projects which really are not made for by people to thrive in, but really are just to keep people in, and then sort of thinking about, we have these spaces, how can we run these spaces? Maybe we can start daycare centers, maybe we can hire our own security guards, maybe we can start job training, and really see these spaces, again, not as places of concentration and containment, really as spaces of possibilities. This is, I think, two different images of thinking about policing, which is the second policy area that I look at. The map is actually the farm radical. This is created by a Black actor, Canadian group. And essentially what they argue is they are for radical decentralization. And that each area of Oakland should essentially be run by the sort of dominant ethnic group that is in that area. And again, this is coming out of a decade, almost a decade of heavy state repression that the police nationally Panthers, but here, why the Black Panthers here is this sort of huge police brutality that's taking place. On the other side is a very long list coming from this sort of York's its own Black Power conference. And essentially, what they're arguing is that, well, we're going to become the majority population in the city, and we don't really feel the need to blow things up because we're going to control it. But we want to control, as I said, very particular way. We want the Black chief of police. We want to close residency requirements. We want to close education requirements. So it really set much more conformist kind of approach to policing as opposed to sort of like far more radical approach that folks in Oakland were looking at. And then the final policy area that I look at is education. It's kind of hard to see, but essentially, in all of these places, they had this idea of freedom schools, and creating schools that were separate from these educational systems that weren't working for the now majority Black and brown school districts. In all of these places, the school systems were majority Black by 1964, 1965. The administration of the schools did not, and the teaching force of the schools did not match them. And so in New York City, we often think about Ocean Hill-Brownsville's communities for the moment of debates over community control, but this is happening everywhere. It's happening before, it's happening before. Three other things. So one, which is basically looking at sort of freedom schools or independent Black institutions in New York, but I think two sort of, and then the lower picture is the picture of Marcus Foster, who becomes the first Black superintendent of the school system, and he's actually assassinated 2 or 3 years after he gets there by the civilians, the Russian army, who kills him for very strange reasons, and then they kidnap Patty Hearst to kind of cover up the fact that they screwed up by assassinating this very popular Black there's another thing, and this is both in East Palo Alto and Oakland, these actually were education innovators, in the sense that these were places where they said, hey, Black kids have been socially isolated, Black communities have been socially isolated, and they actually have their own political framework, what we now call AAVE, African American Voting Bodies. And so it's in places like East Palo Alto and Oakland, they're saying that it's not simply to have control of these systems, it's we have to actually change what's happening in the classrooms itself, and we think about what it is that we're teaching kids, how we're teaching kids. And so again, going back and thinking about Black Power Urbanism isn't simply sort of assuming and taking sort of political office, it's actually changing the ways that we do things, changing the ways of how we think about what a city is doing, how a city is doing. But of course, we also think about Black Americans. And so I think part of the story then is about pushing back on three kind of ideas that are out there. Is pushing back against work on the Black Power movement, which sort of sees it as sort of archaeology and failure. We're going to talk about this, that the Black Power movement was a failure, right? Like we didn't create a new party coming out of this sort of Black Power conference in Gary, Indiana, and that because there wasn't sort of the mission of this kind of durable third party, that's how it's a failure. I'm like, party? Well, no, maybe not. Maybe actually we can see and we should celebrate some of those successes. I think the second thing I'm also kind of questioning is that when we often think about urban politics, we think of it as, again, this sort of Black American story, right? That, oh, is there Black Americans or not? And that sort of determines whether or not a Black regime is successful or not. And most often it's led to kind of a story about Black urban political empowerment being one of sort of the hollow prize, right? That yes, sure, you got a Black but things didn't really change, things didn't get better. Again, part of my book is saying, well, things did change. And maybe the successes were short-lived, but they durably change how we think about what a city does. Can't you imagine running a school system without any kind of presence of community control? That comes out. We can't think about policing without knowing that we're either agreeing or disagreeing, that we're happy with that sort of factor of police brutality is in front of us. Whether or not we effectively address it or not, that is clearly on the table. It's clearly part of our reach. Things about what's significant. Each we're in a city that's significant Black population. It is a myth. You can't not think about it. And the same thing for housing as well. And then I think the third kind of school of thought that I push against is kind of a left kind of view of cities, again, particularly ideas from folks like Harvey, right to the city, who I think don't really haven't adequately acknowledged the fact that these sort of struggles that they identify happening in the 1960s, this kind of urban revolt, is in many cases Black Power urbanism. That this is the revolt that they're sort of looking to provoke in their analysis. So I'm going to leave with the idea for care, which is what I hope to get out of it. Recently, in the last couple of years, Baraka has proposed creating a museum of justice, but also a center for prevention of public health, prevention of violence, because in his review, urban violence is actually a public health problem. And this is something that is very quite new, that urban violence is not simply a matter of policing, it is actually a matter of trying to sort of fix sort of underlying conditions that create it. And so this is also significant because the fourth precinct is the epicenter of the urban war rebellion. And then the second image is, oh, I'm missing something. The second image is actually moms for housing. This is a group of moms who take over one of the houses that had been closed during the 2008 and had been renovated and was about to be sold by a flipper. And he basically said, hey, we have houses that are empty and we are mothers and children who need houses. And they very explicitly use a bunch of language that's in sort of Black So again, this idea of kind of repair. So I guess the sort of big story is that I wrote this novel based on investigation in the past, but really see this as a way for us to think about possibilities. How can we create cities that are emancipatory cities where people can survive, certainly people can thrive rather than simply survive. So that is the book, and thank you for listening. Sit down. Okay, glass of water.
I don't know.
Full professor.
Okay, I'll go first.
By the way, Chrissy just got promoted to professor.
I do just need to take a quick point of panelist privilege. When I got to Columbia University for my PhD in 2001, they told me about this one other Black woman who had gone to Columbia before me, and it was Kim Johnson, who's been a mentor and a friend in ways that you just can't even imagine. And so part of my full professorship is dedicated to who I've known since before she had a book, and now she's on book number, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I was joking, it's like I've known Kim for a long time, and I knew Domingo when he was just getting into graduate school. We talked about his dissertation, we talked about his first book, Oxford University Press. So we go way back.
And by the way, that first book, you had a conversation with Mayor Ross Barack. She didn't know it.
And I just put that as an asterisk because you said Ross Barack, and I was like, I wonder if everybody in here knows that Ross Barack is the mayor of Philly.
Oh, wait, sorry.
Okay, so I just have lots of thoughts on this book. I loved it, and I was trying not to text Kim every 5 minutes. Just, I love this passage. So I just have some thoughts that it led me to, because it's a positive book, and it doesn't leave us in many ways. A lot of urban politics books where it's like it's doom and gloom. This country hates Black people. It's explicit, and so that's the book. But it did leave me with these questions of, and anyone who knows me knows that I care about 2 things: Black people and cities. That's it. And so the larger question for me was, what does freedom for Black people in these cities, then and now, as we sort of move past it? What does movement look like? So I'm constantly thinking about ideas of Black people moving by choice and also by force, and the space that they occupy that is theirs temporarily or permanently. And what does that mean when cities are regenerative? There's constant movement of people being pushed out. So when we think about like a raisin in the sun, it's Black people leaving to move into a new neighborhood. But then that later, like 50 years later, Clydeburg Park is when white people are moving back into the neighborhood that Blacks occupied, but Whites fled first. So who owns a neighborhood is always a question for me. And then this idea of like, can Black people ever be free in America? And as I looked at some of the great photos that you have in here, and this constant fight for freedom, and this constant fight on a local, state, and national level to be recognized and respected by the government was always something that is still in question in this very hostile relation to Black people. And I'm just going to talk about Black people explicitly. Kim does, obviously allude to the fact that they're Latinos, they're Native populations, they're Asian populations all across the country. I focus on Black people. But I do think that this positive understanding of, it's a realistic optimism that I close the book feeling, where it's not a Pollyanna sort of like, oh, we can just like work hard and have some mimeographs and, some others will do these things, and it'll happen. And so these 3 areas of housing, education, and policing always feel like the 3 third rails that handicap mayors and elected officials. Because housing is not just where I live, but do I want you in community with me? And if you're in community with me, we started today talking about, so then where do our kids go to school? And do I want, aside from thinking about integrating schools in the private housing project, you would have thought that it was like 1968 Mississippi, the way people were sort of screaming about not wanting certain kids from housing projects to be theirs, and then policing, as we think about who governs us, but we know that Black can turn to blue really quickly, so this descriptive versus substantive representation of police officers always gets a little wonky.
so I love the cities that you chose. I obviously was reading this the entire time thinking about Queens and home ownership, sort of some fights that we're still having today. I think about Chiose, who's a city council member from Brooklyn, getting arrested today trying to protect Black families from deed theft and foreclosures. And New York City has so many foreclosures, they actually had to stop their foreclosure program at different points in time. It's like we just got too many houses. Like we're just, it's too much housing stock that we've kind of taken away from these Black families. And I was also thinking about, what does this story look like in a place like Detroit, in a place like St. Louis, when we had Pruitt-Igoe, we didn't have Pruitt-Igoe, and Chicago, and then, as I call them, the tier 2 and the tier 3 cities that aren't sort of, be real, right? But it's like, they're cities that just aren't like that. And so, well, how does the story change if we're in Atlanta? Atlanta is a city, but some of the suburbs are really Black, and they're really big, and they kind of operate in their own city-esque ways. And this, you sort of mentioned bond ratings, which is something that I think that I worked with our college during 4 years ago, about when a city gets a Black mayor, and how the bond rating change. And now I guess we have to add
The socialist man.
yeah, if the city gets a non-white mayor, I should change it. You can see what that looks like, because we're having this bond rating conversation now. And so I also was curious, does this story change if we add in Black ethnics of today? So thinking about my first book about Africans and Caribbeans and the social organizations that they have to protect their neighborhoods. So I'm thinking about, say, like Liberians, Northern Staten Island, or Ghanaians in the Bronx, who are sort of politically minded, Haitians in parts of Brooklyn, and socially activated to protect the land that they've sort of established and the communities that they're establishing, and wanting to stay in these cities. The laying out of sort of explicit hostilities of Black people macro and micro levels over time, I think just had far too many parallels to 2026 that it's just troubling about this nation, which made me really think about the small wins, which are worth it, and the snowball wins, which are incredibly important. But there's an underlying rot in the roots of this country in some ways when it comes to this perpetual hostility towards Black people. And Black people still fighting to make something better in other cities, despite all of that. And so this modern story of Blacks between cities is interesting to me, but not just this kind of southern migration north, but now I'm actually thinking a lot more about the northern migration south and how this story changes. And the story that you really tell so beautifully of like the segregated metropolis is really segregation in a lot of cities. I mean, we're operating in many ways. In this city, I always say, I went to school in Boston, I'm like, New York's way more segregated than Boston. I was like, that's not true. I'm like, first of all, I lived in Boston. It is. Like, it doesn't feel that way to some, but to others, New York is an incredibly segregated city. And so then you got me thinking about Black suburbs. So as Black people have moved and have been forced out of the city, so we always talk about New York now, New York's losing, they lost 20% of the population, 20% every 10 years. Black population, sorry. As I said before, I don't care about cities later. So I'm just talking about later. So the Black population is decreasing. And so what does that mean when Black people are moving out to the suburbs and the suburbs are becoming Blacker as whites reclaim cities? And so there's that cartoon that all of you have done different points in time about white people in cities, they move to the first ring of the suburbs, and Black people are like, okay, I guess we move to the suburbs, and then white people move to the second ring, and Black people are like, okay, I guess we move to the second ring, and then white people move back to the city, they're like, good, all right, so now that you guys are gone, look, we're back. And so now they're back in cities, and so the shadow of all of this felt very Reagan-esque. We're still detangling some of the policies of Ronald Reagan from the 60s and the 80s. And so it really made me think of how long it will take us to detangle the policies of this current president when it comes to housing and education and policing, because there's so many things that are happening so swiftly, you can't even keep hold of it. But what is the undercurrent of this beautiful book is this positive idea that Blacks are constantly creating new spaces, new ideas, and this idea of urban citizenship. So even with what a lot of people define as losses, they're not losses. They're just a series of wins and gains and some retractions. But the beauty and the curse of American democracy is that it ebbs and flows. And so American democracy in many ways is told perfectly through the story of Black people in cities because there are these expansive and sort of retractions. My work is more on Black mayors and the Olive Prize, working with white legislatures, white governors, and white presidents by and large, but I do understand and appreciate this larger institutional narrative and trying to figure out what creates a just city or a just nation. And in many ways, Black people are the canaries in the mine to try and tell other communities what is and is not happening. And so the takeaway for me is you illustrated is that small incremental wins are still wins nonetheless in the ebb and flow of American democracy. And so then just some last like really quick things. That Black and Italian map that you showed, to me, is so indicative of America when we think about gerrymandering and packing people in or packing people up, and how we've been able to have political power. Some people have been able to maintain political power by pushing everyone together in these little silos or pushing them out. I also thought about that map of the picture of East Palo Alto and the role of the university. Because what wasn't on that map when it said Palo Alto is Stanford University. And I'm constantly thinking about, to Columbia, and Kim for our PhD, the role of the university in taking over a city and usually pushing people out, especially the Ivy. And NYU's pretty good at it too, right? You guys have just gone abroad, so it's like, all right, let Columbia steal Harlem, and we'll just steal London. But still, does it nonetheless. But Fordham does it, CUNY does it, Penn, you know, like in Rhode Island, Brown. I mean, all of the Ivies do it, and universities do it. And so, you know, the joke is that universities are just real estate agencies that teach kids on the side. Some do it better than others. And so, Adam Clayton Powell being in that picture, you know, he represents Harlem. It's not just Adam Clayton Powell, but it's like Adam Clayton Powell is sort of one of these beginning dominoes with the expansion of Columbia and Harlem. Charles Wrangell solidifies it 46 years. But this idea of university expansion and Black movement and push out is a story that I couldn't stop thinking about. These coalitions, short-term and long-term. And then the last piece I'll say is Jesse Jackson. I needed more Jesse Jackson. If I have one critique, it's like I needed some Jesse Jackson in this book. Because Jesse Jackson talks about political violence and poverty and public health in his 1969 Playboy interview that's 25 pages. But the book that, you know, the article I wrote, I was like, it's not a book, it's just some feelings. But all of these Black men specifically, and some Black women, who worked on his failed 84 and 88 campaigns, ultimately become the first Black mayors in their cities, and like the first police chiefs, and the first superintendents, and the first. So this failed presidential campaign gives us David Dinkins, the first Black mayor of New York City in 1989 after the campaign. It gives us Wilson Goode in Philadelphia. It gives us Donna Brazile. I mean, so in like tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 cities, this idea of Jesse Jackson is actually one that sort of assists with it. And so when you talk about some of the issues, he to me is like a shadow hand in this fantastic book. And then the very last thing I'll say is Eric Adams. I just feel like, and I know we all have a collective side, but I feel like your book proves the point. I mean, he says it. He's like, history is going to be kinder to me, and it's like, and it will. I mean, there are things that he did economically and descriptively and substantively. I have a lot of smoke for Eric Adams. If anybody to FAQ-NYC, you know this. But there's a legacy of Black Power Urbanism that he does understand, or he did understand before he moved to Albania, that I do think he proves your point in a lot of ways. And even though he was not a perfect mayor, there were some really great pebbles in the jar that we have to sort of respect and accept.
I want to know what those are.
Right.
We can talk about that. But great comments, Chrissy. So, you know, I had a chance to have a conversation with Kim about these ideas several years ago. I thought we had met at your house last year, and it was actually 2 years ago that we met. So this conversation that you and I had about your book was probably 6, 7 years ago. I can't remember, right? And I was so excited about what she was sharing at that point, and even more excited now to read. In fact, I think it's one of the most important books written about urban politics and Black politics for the last 20 years, and I'll tell you why. So prior to coming to NYU, I taught at Rutgers for 7 years. I served on the Newark Public Library for 6 years. I was appointed by the Abrams. And I have been researching Newark politics for about 15 years. And in doing the research and teaching and serving on this public board, governing body, as political scientists who study urban politics, this is what we do. We're reading all the work that people put out. And I was just never satisfied. I was never convinced that our urban politics research was actually capturing what was happening, what I was experiencing and observing in a place like that. And I think this book really fills a massive gap in the research. And so what Kim obviously is telling us, take the Black Power stuff seriously, right? Where it's been dismissed by many people. That the Howard Prize maybe is not the best way to think about the way to frame this conversation. And so she's providing both a different perspective on history, a theoretical framework, and a language to get us to really think about what has happened very, very differently, right? And what she's telling us is through these stories, Newark, Oakland, East Palo Alto, and East Orange. But as you were, I think, alluding to, Chris, you could think about this in many different cities, right? So you can think about this in, our colleague, who's here today, Council Brewer, how he's written about Detroit. My mentor, our friend, Marion Moore, how he's written about Baltimore. Our mentor too, Diane Kennedy, who's written about Chicago. And of course, one of the greats in urban politics, Clarence Stone, who's written about Atlanta. We can apply this framework to all of those things. Of course, they don't do it, they're thinking about it very differently. But we can apply it to them. And what you're telling us here is that, these cities often, but not recognized, often being led by women, right? In many different ways, with a vision of a just city, that they're just trying to figure it out. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to figure it out. And as they're figuring it out, they have to endure massive attacks. The schools get taken over. Other local institutions get taken over. The federal government says, we're going to withdraw funding. The business community, including the bond rating agencies, say, if you don't follow our program, we're going to make it very difficult for you to borrow. And this is something that, like W.B. Du Bois was talking about during writing about Reconstruction, how Black communities were punished for borrowing money, right? Just because they needed to borrow money, increase taxes to serve the needs of their community, that they were getting punished for this. This is exactly what's happening post-1960s in these communities, right? And so, you, I think, do a wonderful job of helping us think through all of this in ways that doesn't dismiss these efforts, right? And so, the kind of question that I have is, here you call it repair, but in the book you have the conclusion is the rise and fall of Black urban governance, right? I like the repair part better, and I think you're capturing this as well too. They have this positive, right, aspect of this. That's how I read the book, and that's how I try to think about it, particularly, again, going back to how I understand the experience of folks in Newark. So, the question that I have, which again, I think is some ways addressed by the way that you bring it in terms of repair, is the narrative of this archaeology of the failure of Black political leadership, Black politics, that narrative is being challenged. Also, part of the problem is that it gets us to think about, in order to understand the success or failure of Black politics, we have to compare it to other communities and other cities and other times, but we really can't. Black governance and Black politics cannot be compared for all of the reasons that you laid out here, and the work that we all do as urban politics scholars who study race. We just can't. So because we can't, there is no such thing, all things being equal when it comes to black politics and black governments because of, again, this barrage of attacks that these communities have had to endure. So if that's the case, if we are convinced that that is the case, then failure and the fall, I don't know that it captures really the experience that, right? And I think that a better way, I think, in my view, to think about this, and this is where I think does a really good job of showing us, is that maybe a better way to kind of measure black urban, black power governance is to think about the many different ways that these communities have kind of constructed infrastructure existence, right? That is the measure, because this question of freedom is, what is it, you know, everything is moving all of the time, you get these attacks, and people always respond. So these black women are responding when it comes to housing. These same black women are responding when it comes to education, right? And so all of these different areas of policy, they are responding. And then the state comes and hits it hard, right? And the part, to be very clear, that they're attacking not because of failure, they're attacking because of success. That because these communities, one, through rebellion, through, you know, more conventional politics, won school board seats, won court cases to get more resources for the school, that is what leads to, both in Oakland and in Newark and many other places, that's what leads to the takeover. It's not like the stuff that people talk about, corruption, that schools are failing. It's not that. If schools were failing, if that was the reason why we're taking over schools across this country, we'll have thousands of takeovers. Thousands. But that's not what's happening. Takeovers are specific to black communities. And it's because these communities in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s said, we don't have the resources to educate our kids, so we have to file lawsuits. And the state has to pony up that. And then, as you were saying with the taxes, okay, you want to raise our taxes to provide funding for these schools? Just take over your schools, right? And that's just one example of many different ways that these communities have had to respond and deal with these issues, right? And they do. And they continuously do. So going back to Newark, and particularly serving on the board of the public library, which is a critically important institution that doesn't get enough attention, I see the many different ways that these communities, I think this community in particular, Newark, is just continuously trying to figure it out. And I just leave it with this, you know, kind of going back to Newark. When I was first doing research there, I was interviewing the chair of the school board at the time, a black woman named Antoinette Richardson. She was a former educator in Newark, born and raised in Newark, and she was chair of a school board that had no power because the state controlled the school district. And what I had probably, I mean, I'm reflecting on this now, I probably had, as I'm, you know, in my early stages of my research there, probably have this mind state of the archaeology of failure, or like the Howard Prize, and saying like, wait, why aren't people like protesting this, right? Why aren't the young people doing more, right? And what she said to me when I asked her that question, she said, every generation does what it can. And later that year, so I only had been, you know, studying this at the time I talked to her a couple of weeks, but a year later, students in Newark took over the administration. They held walkouts and shut down major highways. And the next year, after 25 years of state control, the state gave control back to Newark. And the reason why is because these kids, these young kids, decided that we're not going to take it. Right? And so, just another example of how they're figuring it out. And so, again, I prepared these thoughts with that question, right, about the rise and fall, that I don't think that the fall is really, I think it's more of the repair part that we captured here, about how people are going to do it.
Thank you. These are really great comments. A couple of things. First, when you're writing a book, so kind of choices. And the book was like originally like from 1900 to 2000. And my editor, but no, certainly my husband, was like, that would be fun. So choices were made. And part of it was like really thinking about was one story I really tell, and that's the story about Power Urbanism. And then trying to figure out what was the beginning. The beginning was sort of easier to figure out. But I think in the book, the end, actually that conclusion was actually one of the hardest stories, because I felt like the story wasn't over yet. But in one way, in some ways, there wasn't a story that was Reagan and liberalism. That basically just, by design, Reagan just pulls the roots out of urban planning, starts these processes, and this is where we get the reform governors and reform educators that are saving the children from corruption. We get the war on crime. We get all these things that when we think about like how cities are when we think about like the sort of urban crisis of the 1980s, a lot of this is impacted with the sort of effects of urbanism. So that felt like a way to sort of pause the story before and end the book. I think someone mentioned that Jimmy Carter does not fall in this book. Because it really is, I think, like you said, a sort of inability of institutions to kind of operate these challenges. And so seeing Jimmy Carter, someone who is representing new South, who South is, and a Democratic Party that still is kind of thinking about how much do we really want to build on this liberal thing, how much do we really want to try to keep attached to others, and also sort of growing suburban backlash that makes it was so successful and kind of moved out. So that's, I think, part of the story is kind of trying to figure out where to sort of end the story, so it wouldn't be 1,000 pages. But also, I think a story that kind of captured particular kind of politics, and that Black politics in the wake of Reagan and liberalism was different. One of the things that was striking is when I interview people, wherever I went, they would say, well, at least one, maybe not many would say, you don't understand what this neighborhood looked like before crack. That the crack epidemic is like this neutron, not a neutron, it is a bomb that goes, that just explodes in these communities. There's a great photographer named Will Vargas, who has this sort of time series images of movies in other cities, and he, takes a picture of a building in 1975, and then by 1992 it's an empty lot, right? You can just literally see this decay, and a lot of it is the sort of war on crime, it's the crack. It's the sort of fundamental that's happening because of violence, etc. So I think that's kind of a different story that should and then Jesse Jackson, that's a whole different story. It's a whole story, and I think particularly since his recent passing, to think about, so we have a mutual colleague, Phil Thompson, who worked on Jesse Jackson's campaign and then worked for David Dinkins, now as a professor at MIT in the planning department. But just recently there was an announcement that they were going to use pensions to sort of backstop affordable housing in New York City. This is something that Phil Thompson has been banging on about for literally decades. Let's get these pensions and let's make these pensions do things for cities. And so I think, like you said, there's this kind of lineage that's coming out of Jackson that's, I think, an important story for cities, and for a lot of politics. That needs to be told, but that's unfortunately.
Well, but I think this book, the reason why I think Domingo and I are so wowed by it is because it opens, not only does it tell a very concrete and succinct, succinct story, but it also opens the door and the window to so many other stories about urban politics, Black protest politics, Black elite level politics. I mean, it raised a lot of different avenues for us to discuss. Something that, quite honestly, when I started graduate school, I was told by the director of graduate studies, where I was like, I want to study cities, that's my thing. And he said, first day of graduate school, cities are dead. And I was like, but how can cities be dead? One, if Black people live in cities. And two, we're in New York City. And so, when I was in grad school, and you were there just a year before me, but like, the idea of urban politics wasn't as a discipline sort of defined. And so maybe the reason why this book, I feel like, fills up a lot of gaps is because we're still, like, there's a dearth in the discipline where this book should sort of have, I would say, 12 other books before it. But you've had to kind of put together these 4 cities where I think that it should have a much deeper foundation from other scholars of urban politics. But we kind of had almost 20 years of people not looking through the archives, like American political development, to think about Black power politics in this way. And so that to me it's a shame, but this is like the beginning of a resource. But I think because it's such a resource, I want more avenues for the resource.
Okay, yeah, sure. Questions?
Yeah.
I'm sorry I was late. I missed the accident before, of course, but so I missed a little bit. I missed a little bit of the beginning. So, pardon me if my questions are redundant. I'll just do one question that's redundant. But we also haven't, and I haven't read the book yet. I haven't heard the words Barack Obama mentioned, and
My students are looking at me because I would like to know.
because maybe there was before I got here, I might be. I'm just wondering, I'm fascinated by the conversation about what Jesse Jackson led to that came out. I also think there's a mindset, of course, that would never have, no matter what your feelings are about Obama, that would not have happened. So I'm just wondering about, and I realize, as you said, you can't do it all in one book, but I can see that we're so hungry for it, we're expecting it all. But I just was wondering about his connection to this, in terms of the whole cosmopolitanism that is, that's coming into cities now, the multiracial cosmopolitanism. And there's just 2 other things that I thought about when we say the words Black Power, and thinking about it in a 90s way. That one of there was a cover story in Fortune magazine called The New Black Power. I don't know whether any of you saw it or remember it, but it was actually their best-selling cover back in the old days when people purchased magazines and didn't just go to the just didn't go online. And it had all of these Black figures that were in many ways the money behind Marianne Spraggins and all these that were the money behind a lot of the campaigns, the David Dinkins campaign, the Jesse Jackson campaign, and they had all risen in positions in corporate America. And the cover was on them, and speaking of them, I was thinking they would never have existed without the opportunities that they found in the Jackson campaign.
Can I just let
Yeah, and I'll let you take it from there.
So there was an image that I didn't talk about. It was Cory Booker sitting with Mark Zuckerberg and Chris Christie, who I had a little bit of Chris, but that was a whole Perkins in. And I think that in some ways that was symbolic of the kind of I don't think it's overused, but like kind of an elite politics, post-racial maybe politics, very much tied to sort of Wall Street sort of money. And Cory has gone on his way, and Chris Christie is doing whatever he's doing. And Mark Zuckerberg, I mean, the interesting story that Digital Policy told is that not quasi sort of charter adjacent, and the idea was that it was going to be open to all the people, the children in the community. It was going to be sort of progressive outpost, and maybe 6 months or so after Trump was elected, they closed the school. And so I think there's that's a whole different story, and I think I allude to it along the way in a little bit in the conclusion that, once we sort of let in after sort of the 80s and sort of resurgence of, not resurgence, that the sort of politics in the 90s and the early 2000s, there is kind of a local black politics, as Lester Spence, among others, talk about.
If I could just add something to that. So Obama, in many ways, reflects the same vision that Cory Booker had on education. And so they represent that type of ideology about education, which was rejected by black Newarkers, They were rejecting Cory Booker from the beginning, and particularly his ideas on education. So the superintendent he helps appoint, Cammie Anderson, they were knocking on her door, like, get out of here. We don't want you here, So.
And then a final point, it's like, don't forget, Cory Booker loses his first race.
Yeah.
Right? Because black Newarkers, we're not interested. And I would highly recommend going on YouTube and watching the 2004 DNC. There are 3 speeches that are great. Cory Booker gives a speech that no one remembers, but he has top billing compared to Barack Obama.
Yeah.
Right? Barack Obama gives this speech and wows him, and so he becomes the talking point, but he had a worse time slot than Cory Booker. But the real speech that you need to listen to is Al Sharpton's speech, which is 22 minutes long. Sadly talking about a lot of surprise, right? But he's sadly talking about a lot of the issues that we're still concerned with. But he talks about education, he talks about housing, he talks about policing in a very national but city way, in ways that neoliberal Barack Obama and Cory Booker never.
And I really look forward to reading it because I really, I appreciate the work of the mention of the freedom schools. And because the black private school movement that grew up in the 70s and the 80s educated many people who went on to become activists and educators, and from the Chad School in Newark to the East Palo Alto, you had the Shoelay. And I don't know where many of those schools were closed. The Talking Toledo in Detroit had closed a couple of years ago. But they were really very, very important and substantive educational spaces in urban communities. That's all I'm going to say. Other people have questions.
Kind of a follow-up to that question, but I'm curious, like when I saw that Mark Zuckerberg Cory Booker photo, I thought about like the massive donation to Newark charter schools, and I'm curious how charter schools fit in this lineage where they feel like very of Reagan era neoliberalism, but then also using a lot of the rhetoric of Reagan schools, particularly in Boston.
No, I think that's correct. And I think that the charter schools, we talk about like Oakland, for example. So Oakland, the schools get taken over, and the then governor proposes that taking over these schools because of the alleged corruption. But it really is that essentially the majority black and brown board was like, well, we should pay the contracts for those services to people that are in the community or outside of it. There's a lot of things that are going on. But as soon as the board takeover happens, then they then open it up to charter schools. The same thing happens once the takeover happens. Then charter schools sort of step into it. There's a number of us from Montclair. I just want to note that one of the sort of colleagues of the Newark superintendent was installed by pro-charter people who were funding charter schools in Newark, and decided, well, we need sort of that in this kind of mixed income diverse community, and basically that person gets run out because suddenly it's the middle class people who are like, we're not anymore. here, our property taxes should not be at full levels. So they get pushed out. So it's interesting that charter schools, at least in the East Coast, are still much seen as places for troubled populations, versus I think in a lot of places now, charter schools are kind of just becoming the quasi, the way that public school system is transforming and have a really nice racial
Can I just say one other thing? So this is also an attack on not only black communities, but black teachers. So New Orleans was the state of Louisiana takes over the New Orleans public schools and converts them all into charter schools. The largest black teaching force in the country was in New Orleans prior to Hurricane Katrina, when the state takeover happened. And then within 10 years, it decreased by like 30%. So it's a takeovers lead to charter schools, which is not just an attack on black communities, but specifically on the attack on black teachers.
I'm excited to read this. I haven't, so to the extent that this question reveals that, I apologize. But this conversation about charters, I want to connect to and then ask a slightly broader question. So I have thought every day this week since I learned that the people attached to the Success Academy network in New York are going to open a school in the South Bronx in the fall that is supposed to be open 7 days a week, all year, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. It is a total containment by this white educators of black properties in the South Bronx. That's what it is. And so I'm bringing it up not only because it's another manifestation of this charter logic, but because it reminds me of how much I wanted to hear you talk about space in this book. And sort of, so these are the two questions. One, what is it for you as a political scientist to pay attention to space in the way you are in this book? And how is that new in relationship to the ways that I, not as a political scientist, think about the discipline's engagement with space? And secondly, especially with this image here, the tiny young person on the right, bottom right, what is Black Power Urbanism's vision of children in the city?
So I think I'll talk about space, which is that I remember I had presented it a couple of years ago, and someone later said at some political science department, they said, well, that's a lot of maps. It just was a lot of maps. And I think a lot of images, which is I think very different from political science, and I don't know what's time here. But I think political scientists tend to think about voters as individuals, and then like voters as and then interest groups as an aggregation of individuals, and then that individuals who inhabit lines that are drawn on a map, that these lines are politically constructed, and that can be sort of reconstructed and deconstructed, packed, what have you. And I think what I was trying to sort of think about is that one of the things when you teach urban politics is the one thing that cities have is they have ultimate control over space. In fact, they can create space, right? So Hudson Yards wholly created space, right? And so that's what makes urban politics different, is that it is this sort of fight over who gets to do what, when how, who gets to extract, who gets to benefit from what's happening in space. So for me, space is all about kind of how people are brought together, or separated, how they can be supported. And that, I think, is very different from most sort of political scientists. I think maybe someone like Neil Key, who was a Southern political scientist, published in 1949, and I have another book that talks about it a lot, was like probably the last sort of political scientist who really thought about what does space do? How is it sort of bringing people together? How is it shaping people? So I'm kind of, and I think that is my bridge between the different parts of the political science field, politics, those space, then system, it's not commerce, or and I think in terms of children, I think I come back to, I think education is where you really see it, that it's not simply we want more black teachers, we want more black teachers because we think the teachers that are coming in from the suburbs are not training our kids well, that they're pushing our kids out either to, and particularly this is during the Vietnam War, so there's a kind of push out, and then many of these young men end up getting drafted because they're in school. And I think it's a matter of, and I think it's really the interesting part which makes it different from the civil rights movement, because it's no longer about integration. It really becomes, why is it that our schools have worse resources? Why is it that our schools were in trailers versus having this, I'm talking about Oakland, they built this big new high school and drew lines so that no black or Hispanic students could go to this beautiful high school called Skyline High. And so I think that's part of our kids should get as much as we can, and then maybe more in a way that is good for them. So I think it's really interesting that they talk about what we now call cultural competence in all the ranks. Bilingual education is front and center before it actually becomes a thing at the national level. We're saying we need teachers who can speak Spanish and who can help our Puerto Rican neighbors. And then I think finally what I would say is that even for the kind of policing and housing, I think the idea is that these aren't safe places for children. These are not places that children can grow and flourish and to be all that they want to be.
I'm curious about how each of these cities there was pushback within the black community. I mean, you have this photograph of Adam Lake Howell looking rather handsomely over the speaker. But to what extent was the traditional black leadership in churches and also in the political machines of the 50s? What role did they play in either dividing electorates, making it difficult for black mayors as well, regardless of what was going on with the previous wave of opposition in the city?
Spirit contested. I mean, I think that's the thing that we see. Like, every time I've spoken about this, people ask, well, what do you mean by the black community? Because there's no black community, there's multiple black communities. And so I think that part of the story is the sort of tension and competition between different groups who have different ideas about the future of the black community, of black people in the city, not the black community. Tensions with how do you engage or not engage with current institutions. And I think, if anything, like, in some ways the book ends kind of on a sort of downer note, in the sense that despite the sort of prominence of Black Panthers, Lionel Wilson ends up becoming the mayor. Lionel Wilson is kind of someone kind of not part of the sort of reform structure of but certainly not someone who was like marching in the streets against it. And so you have this kind of administration that is very much class. And so it's sort of jarring because after all of that, this kind of black and same work, you get Ken Gibson. But Ken Gibson had always been like, I'm an engineer and I'm really like, I'm a Democrat, but I'm like a machine Democrat, I'm not a radical. But the folks behind him say like, this is our chance to kind of get both people who are radicalized and people who are sort of moderate blacks, but then also kind of try to also create a multiracial coalition. So it's interesting that when we do look at the first black mayors, I mean, these are almost all moderates. These are all people who were elected by, a combination of black, brown, Jewish, liberal Jews. Tom Bradley, Wilson, Stokes, they I mean, like, so all the, I mean, so I think that's the tension, is that to get to the America, you are pushed to the center, and that's always the tension with people who are in these communities who are pushing kind of further left and pushing for more support over control.
Tim, you say, sorry.
No, go ahead.
You write in the book about that period of time, how folks would say unity without uniformity, right? So that, it's, when you think and you break that down, that's, you know, it's that fight, right? And so Marion Orr, our friend, my mentor, wrote this book about Charles Diggs, where, you know, Charles Diggs and Amiri Baraka are leading this convention in Gary, and they're fighting it out, right? And what's the vision for black politics that's gonna win out? Is it gonna be like this more, you know, black nationalist, more progressive, or is it gonna be the more, you know, central party politics, Democratic Party politics? You know, it's still a question, right? I mean, you know, Ras Baraka is mayor and ran for governor, you know?
But I think the footnote to that 72 convention where they're fighting it out is that they want someone on the national party ticket. Sorry about that. And they say, well, you know, Lori Steiner and her folks are choosing a woman. We need a black person. And Shirley Chisholm steps up and says, well, then I can do it. And so this is where we're bringing in gender politics. At the tension in 1972, where it's like, do we go with the right or left? We've got SNCC, we got CORE, we got SCLC, we got the Panthers, we got the institutions, we got the neoliberals that we don't call neoliberals yet, we got the elitists, we got black, you know, sort of politics and respectability. All these people are fighting it out. Shirley Chisholm says, I'll do it. And by black, we mean white. Right?
Slow down.
Slow down. But then she goes to her feminist friends, and Gloria Steinem's and Bella Abzug's of the world, so like, we have to have a woman on the ticket in 1972. Shirley Chisholm says, I'll do it. Shirley Chisholm, first black woman elected to Congress in 1960. And they say, well, by woman, we need a woman, right? So this tension cross-cuts a lot of different ways when we think about black party capture, because we have the ideological diversity of every other group. It's just 90% of us are trapped into one party, because the other party currently has chosen to cast their lot with white supremacy. So like, this has been the tension for black people, because there's a lot of intellectual and political diversity in one party where we're trying to figure out what's the best to lead. So like, we tend to go to the Cory Booker one. This is why Eric Adams is the best. We gotta have a different battle. Because he breaks that mold of the sort of politics and respectability of black mayors that we've seen time and time again.
And the girls. Now I'm going to finish.
Yeah, well, you know, Hakeem gets mad, he's like, I'm like the light-skinned, light-eyed crew. I'm like, that whole evolve, whatever.
Would you like to take the last word?
Yes.
So this has been a journey. I actually want to do a quick anecdote, which is that this title comes from my middle son. Originally the title was supposed to be Chocolate Seeds, blah, blah, blah. Taken by this wonderful sociologist, Marcus Hunter. I'm on the couch. I can't do it anymore, I can't do it. My middle son, if you've ever met him or ever know, he goes, what's the matter, Mom? Well, I don't have a title, I can't write the book. He's like, oh my God, what's the book about? I say, oh, it's about black people. What about black people in cities? Looks at me and goes, dark. And that's
There you go.
and that's the book. So
Thank you so much for writing the book.